Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. Now we're now looking at the games of Henry Nelson Pillsbury. We've just finished looking at the games of Carl Schlechter, and with Henry Nelson Pillsbury, Reti only offers one full game. However, he offers three separate positions from some of Pillsbury's games that are quite instructive in terms of getting pawn breakthroughs. Now, before I go on to that, an introduction to Pillsbury. He was born in the US in 1872. He learned to play chess at 16, so quite late, and he still managed to beat a lot of prominent masters of the time. He had an even score against Lasker, 5 wins, 5 losses, 4 draws. An even score against Steinitz, 5 wins, 5 losses, 3 draws. And he had actually beaten Janowski, Moxie, and Schlechter as well. He had dropped the occasional game to Chigorin and Tarrasch, though. Now, Pillsbury was very influenced by chess theory at the time. At the time, closed games were far more common. It was far more common to close the center and to try and restrict your opponent. Any mistakes that your opponent makes, whether in the opening or positional mistakes, you would then punish them by restricting them and suffocating them more and more before then breaking through by advancing the pawns on the flank and trying to open up the game to your advantage. Now, how you broke through was what often differed. Sometimes it could just be a normal pawn push, other times it could be a pawn sacrifice, other times a piece sacrifice. And the super aggressive breakthroughs that often involved a pawn sacrifice or piece sacrifice were sometimes characteristic of Pillsbury. Pillsbury was very strong tactically. He was able to see a lot of combinations, and he had a very strong desire to win, which allowed him to turn some losing positions into winning positions. Now, this position is one of those examples, actually. Tarrasch has the black pieces, and it has moved 28 with Tarrasch to move, black to move. Oh, sorry. In this position, it's moved 28 with black to move. And Tarrasch has a bit of an advantage. The computer thinks he has an advantage as well. And we see how Pillsbury is able to create some complications and win in this position. So Tarrasch, first of all, plays queen to a4. And this appears to be quite decisive. Tarrasch is threatening to take these pawns. If knight c1 to try and defend, then queen c2 could come, and white's queenside will just be lost. And black's going to have 3 very strong passed pawns that are going to come they're going to come very fast. So after queen a4, white has to respond in some way, and Pillsbury finds the best move, knight to g4. So instead of trying to defend and go passive with knight c1, he starts counterpunching. He's in the corner and he fights back. And now with this move, he's threatening to take on f6. So if queen takes a2, then suddenly black's advantage disappears. Knight takes f6. Because after g takes f6, queen takes f6, king g8. If the rook blocks, then rook g4 is just game over. The only way you can really defend is by bringing the knight back in. You don't particularly want to be in this position. So king to g8, but then rook g4 anyway, and again the only way to really defend is by bringing the knight in. And f takes g6. Black is lost in this position. There's many ways that he could possibly win. So instead of that, so knight g4. So Pillsbury played knight to g4. threatening to take this pawn and win, meaning that Tarrasch has to respond. He can't just grab this pawn like he wanted to. So he plays knight to d7, defending the f6 pawn. Pillsbury again finds the best move, rook 4 to f2. And now we see king to g8. Queen takes a2 still fails because of knight f4. Then after something like bishop f7, knight to g6 would come. And this pawn is pinned. Bishop takes, pawn takes, knight f8. This is all the variations given by Reti. You then have knight takes f6. Because after g takes f6, queen takes f6. If you block with the rook, queen to c6 could potentially be an option, attacking this rook. And of course threatening the knight as well. So this is quite easily winning. It's why queen takes a2 isn't really an option. The computer sees a way to make it work, but the computer's a computer, not a human. So here, Tarrasch plays king to g8. And he's still got an advantage. It's still his game to play for. But now Pillsbury plays knight to c1, defending a2 and defending this second rank. However, black is still able to continue with the queenside attack. And that's what Tarrasch does. He plays c3, hoping to get a breakthrough. He's hoping to try and win one of these pawns and hopefully trade the other one for one of these pawns to try and get 2 passed pawns. And he does just that. We see c3, b3, queen to c6. And now black's plan is simple. a5, a4, a takes b4. After takes, you can then bring this rook in. Note this bishop is and the knight are all defending, so the rook can come down and take the pawn. And it's quite an easy way. It's quite an easy way to. It's an easy plan for black, and black is winning. The computer gives this as minus 2.6 for black. So the only way Pillsbury can really defend against this plan is by counter-attacking. And that's what he does. First of all, he plays h3. And he calculated quite a bit in advance. And this shows the power of his calculation abilities, because this is a quiet move and he's going to play some more quiet moves in the future. And it's almost like, how can you do this? How are you confident enough to play quiet moves like this when you're about to be attacked on the queen side and have a decisive attack against you? Now Tarrasch plays a5. We see knight h2, another seemingly slow move. a4, and now g4. Now a takes b3, a takes b3, rook to a8. And Tarrasch with the black pieces is still winning. His attack is still effective. He's able to still play rook a3 and take this pawn. Now here we see g5, rook to a3. It may have been useful to perhaps try and take the pawn and defend the king side, but rook a3 is still winning. Knight to g4. And now bishop takes b3. Sorry, rook a3 would be a terrible move because it'd just be lost. Bishop takes b3. And this is perhaps almost a losing mistake. Black needed to pause for a moment and defend on the king side. However, given that black now has 2 passed pawns ready to push, this pawn being almost on a second rank, it's quite understandable that black thought he would be first. Now here we see rook to g2. So the threat is something like g takes f6 or knight takes f6. Yeah, if we just have a quiet move, let's say bishop to d5, it's a very quiet move. Then g takes f6 would come, and after knight takes Knight takes f6 check. Note this pawn is pinned, so the queen can't take back either. Something like king f7 is one option. Rook takes g7. If king takes g7, queen takes h7 would come. Taking here is mate, and if you try and run away, something like going to here, you're going to get mated regardless. So after taking this pawn and rook to g2, the threat was to take here or to take here and then simply break through on the king's side with a potential sacrifice on g7. So Tarash plays king to h8, unpinning this pawn. Now we see g takes f6, g takes f6. But he does comment that knight takes f6 doesn't work due to knight to e5. Because now if the queen's attacked, let's say black plays queen to a6, going onto the open file, then obviously knight to g6 would come. Sorry, that's knight f7. Knight to g6 would come, forking the king and the rook, and this pawn is pinned. So because of that, we don't see knight takes f6, we see g takes f6, knight takes b3, rook takes b3, and now knight to h6, threatening rook h8 mate in 1. And the only way to defend that is rook to g7. But after rook takes, king takes, it initially might look as if White's attack is starting to peter out. White's traded off a lot of his defensive. White's traded off a lot of his attacking pieces, and Black just has 2 passed pawns still ready to advance, and are supported already by the queen and the rook. However, Pillsbury with White sees a nice little combination. He plays queen to g3 check, and after king takes h6, king to h1. A nice quiet move. The threat is rook to g1, which would threaten mate, and Black can't stop mate without losing quite a bit of material. In the game, we see queen to d5, rook to g1, as before, threatening mate. If you just try and push the pawn, then queen h4 is mate in 1. So after rook g1, Black takes on f5, but now queen h4 anyway. You have to block to defend. Queen f4 check, and the only way you can really save it is by blocking. Rook takes g5, f takes g5, and it's initially, if you stopped here in your calculations, you may think is this still even potentially lost. Black's got 2 passed pawns. There's a rook and knight versus a queen, so it's not the end of the world. But queen d6 check, king h5, queen takes d7. And here Black still can't push because queen takes h7 is mate. So that was the example of the first breakthrough in a position where actually Pillsbury was actually losing at first. However, he's managed to get some counterplay, and Black had to defend for a few moves rather than just keep trying to push on the queen side. And we saw that actually this very slow build-up, h3, g4, followed by g5, and just breaking through after having all of his pieces well placed to try and attack the opponent's king. And we'll see this style of breakthrough time and time again. Now the next game is by Pillsbury again, and his opponent is Emanuel Lasker this time. So one of the second world champion. Now here it is white to move, and it's move 21. Now here black has an advantage on the queen side. So black's already a pawn ahead and it's on the queen side. And a potential g4 breakthrough is prevented because of black's pawn chain. However, this pawn chain does have a lot of weaknesses. It's got a lot of dark square holes in it. So if white is able to in the future break through on the king side, then white will be able to exploit the holes in black's king side to their advantage. Now here we see f5. G takes f5 and knight to f4. Now here Lasker played h4. He wants to try and prevent queen g3 going up to queen g7. So he plays h4 to obviously guard this square. However, what we see is rook to a1. And Pillsbury's a pawn down. He broke through sort of with the f5 pawn push as a pawn sacrifice. But after taking, again, there's quite a few weaknesses in black's position. Oh, there's this open file. There's these two dark square weaknesses. And we see how Pillsbury is able to exploit that. He plays rook to a1, attacking the bishop. We see bishop to e7, quite a natural move, bringing the bishop back to the defense. But now we see rook takes a4, sacrificing the exchange. But the idea is to try and get the bishop away from the defense of the king, because the plan is to take on e6, and of course the bishop was defending e6. So after f takes e6, knight takes e6, white is now winning overwhelmingly. Now here Lasker just gave up the queen with bishop to d7. And obviously knight takes d8, rook takes d8. And this would be quite easily winning, I think, for someone like Pillsbury. He's got a pawn which is about to be a protected pass pawn, potentially. The king's still in the centre. There is no real safe place for the king. And he's got a queen for a rook and a bishop. And given the broken pawn structure for black, this would be quite easy for Pillsbury to win. But equally, the bishop d7 giving up the queen is actually arguably the best defense. It's just the computer's move, and it's probably the easiest way to prolong the game. Instead, Vetti says if black tried to save it by playing queen d7 instead, and after queen takes f5, despite being a full rook down, white has broken through the position, and black's position is just in pieces. And you may be thinking that you're rook down, but actually, what are these rooks doing? Nothing. They're not actually in the game. As far as I can tell, black is the one who is a rook down, because the rooks aren't playing. Queen to c6 may be one potential option. This is all given by the computer. Bishop g5, bishop takes g5 is one option. Yeah, let's say bishop takes g5. Bishop takes g5 leads to queen f7 mate, so the bishop can't take. So instead, if you try to perhaps get an in-between move and flee with the king, still knight c5 check will come. If the king moves again, bishop takes e7, and this check is being threatened. Oh, not quite, because of the bishop. But it's quite clear that in this instance, white has managed to regain some of the material. They're now only exchanged down. The rooks are still out of play. The king is fully exposed, and all of white's pieces are ready to attack. And all of that started with his f5 pawn breakthrough. He sacrifices a pawn, brings his knight up. He then sacrifices the exchange, and then sacrifices a piece, all to break through and exploit the weaknesses in black's position. So that was a second breakthrough which Reti showed. The third breakthrough is, let's go back, is a game where Pillsbury plays against Isidore Gunsberg. And here we see the same sort of sacrifice we've already seen in the previous game. F5, again, pushing the pawn. Because after g takes f5, rook h3 was played. So here we see rook f7, queen h5. So rook f7 played in anticipation of this queen h5 move because of the threat of mate. Bishop f8, allowing the rook to look at the h7 pawn. Now here we see rook takes f5, a nice little sacrifice. E takes f5, knight to f4. Worth noting, the knight takes here because of this bishop. It would just be mate because the rook is pinned. So the knight is actually sort of pinned to the rook, which is pinned to the king. It's a nice long X-ray pin. Now here we see bishop to b7, defending the knight. It's worth noting the threat here. If just a5, then bishop takes, queen takes, knight takes, and Pillsbury is just up a piece and a pawn. So instead, we see bishop b7, defending the knight, rook to g3 check, bishop to g7. If rook to g7, then Reti gives knight to e6. After queen d7, knight takes g7, bishop takes, bishop to h6, and black is just stuck in this position. So the bishop is pinned, the knight is pinned, and the queen is ready to come and attack. And this bishop is probably almost certainly lost because it's only defended by the queen and the king. So that's what would have happened after rook to g7, defending. But instead we see bishop to g7, defending the check. And now Reti comments that queen takes f5 is probably the best move. Because after something like queen to d7, knight takes d5, queen takes f5, knight to e7 check, king h8, knight takes f5. Note that this bishop has a double attack on it, and the rook is attacked. And in this position, black's rook would likely be lost no matter what, because it's going to continually be attacked whilst it's on a 7th rank until eventually black just has to give up an exchange, because it has to stay on a 7th rank to defend the bishop. And you can't just bring this rook in because you'll lose the rook for nothing. So that's what Reti gives us the best move as being queen takes f5. However, Pillsbury plays rook h3. And Reti comments that he believes Pillsbury did see queen takes f5 and probably thought it was the tactically the better move. However, Pillsbury sort of offers a chance to try and repeat moves almost, just to see what his opponent plays. Pillsbury may be trying to gain time, or it might be seeing if his opponent worsens his position a little bit. Now here we see bishop to h8, and now we see the queen takes f5 maneuver. A queen to d7. Now in this is very similar to before, except the rook is on g3, and before the bishop was on g7. So the key difference here is what we see is knight takes d5 and bishop takes d5. So before we saw queen takes f5 and then knight to e7 check. Obviously the rook is pinned. King f8, knight takes f5, and now the rook is under attack, so rook c7 is given, rook to g3 is given, and this is threatening mate in 1. And here Pillsbury is just quite easily winning. The threat of mate in 1 has to be defended against, and there's no real way to defend against it. If you, say, play king to here, something like bishop e6 could come, just again renewing that threat of mate in 1. And obviously, if you go here, it's mate. So the only real defense is still to try and bring your rook to here, bring your that's the bishop. Bring your rook to here or something, just to try and cover this file, to try and cover this open rank. They're the only real options. So because of that, we don't see queen takes f5 like we saw in the potential previous variation. Instead, we see bishop takes d5. However, after bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, the rook is pinned, so no matter what, this rook will be lost. And after that, white will just be a pawn up in an endgame, and one of these pawns will be a protected pass pawn. So it's quite an easily won endgame for white. So that's the position that occurred after this breakthrough of f5. So g takes f5, rook h3, and then queen h5. And notice how Pillsbury's pieces were able to get into the action very quickly. They were able to straight away jump into rook to h3 and h5. Of course, rook takes f5 is probably quite a hard move to see, and actually the computer gives it as being a dead equal draw at that point. But knight h4, sorry, knight f4, again, not an easy tactic to see. Bishop e7, and now we see how, after the breakthrough has occurred, Pillsbury is able to just win with relative ease and just win by his tactical ability. He broke through at the right time, seeing the tactical consequences. And so there we have it. They're the 3 breakthroughs which Reti offers in his book. So in the next video, we'll be looking at one of the games of Harry Nelson Pillsbury. And it's actually the only game which we're going to see of his in Reti's book. At least the only game where he's the focus. I'm assuming we may have a couple where he is the opponent. And actually, Pillsbury would be the last game that we see of what Reti calls the old masters. After this, he's going to see the modern masters, who obviously are still quite old, but people like Maroczy and Boglubov, Capablanca, Alekhine, and things. But yeah, so that's the 3 breakthroughs that Reti uses to introduce Pillsbury's games. I hope you liked them. And if you did like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.